Why do we trust one another? Trust is the foundation on which we build our society. Rachel Botsman, the Trust Fellow at Oxford University, describes trust as currency. We exchange trust in our interactions. We barter with it quite literally. We ask people to trust us, to be truthful, to keep a promise, to do a thing, and the outcome of that interaction, whether we proved ourselves trustworthy, informs the value of our future interactions. Trust between family and friends and neighbors is built up over time through social interactions. The more time we spend together, the more trust currency is exchanged, and we establish mutual understandings of trust. I know I can trust my neighbor to watch over our house when we're not home. I know I can trust my colleague Shira to make informed decisions about our work together. I know I can trust my friend Rachel to keep our private conversations private. And I know I can trust my wife with everything, including life and death decisions. But here's the thing. Every day, we put our trust in people we don't know, people we have never met, have never interacted with, and people we may never interact with. In August 2016, all of this, how much we depend on our ability to trust one another, became very real for my wife and I. Like his parents, our son Leo was eager to explore everything the world had on offer. So eager, in fact, he decided to arrive a full 6 weeks early. So instead of the birth we had planned with hours of skin-to-skin and co-sleeping, the first few hours of Leo's life included me and a nurse running him through the corridors of a hospital in an incubator, a barrage of tests and sensors and injections and IVs, and hours under the blue light of a UV lamp. Looking back on this now, my memory of our time in the neonatal intensive care unit is clouded by time and stress and everything else. But one memory remains crystal clear. It was a few hours after Leo's arrival, and a doctor sat us down to talk about what would happen next. We will do everything we can to give him the capability to live a full life, she said. And we looked at her and said, "Do what you think is right, doctor. We trust you completely." My name is Morten Rand-Hendriksen, and today I'd like to talk to you about practical ethics for the modern web designer. Entering a hospital to receive care is arguably the most high-stakes trust interaction we can do as humans. We go to a complete stranger and say, "Here, I give you my life or that of a loved one. I trust you with the most precious thing in the world to me. Do with it what you think is best." In these places, more than any other, we place our lives at the hands of others, and we trust that every person we interact with during this experience will do everything in their power to give us the capability to keep living our lives in a way that is meaningful and valuable to us. But why? Why do we trust these perfect strangers with our lives? One word: ethics. We have reason to believe all people are moral actors, and we live in a society rooted in common ethics. When we interact with people we don't know, we choose to believe they adhere to those ethics in their interactions with us. In the case of professionals, like doctors and structural engineers and lawyers and even politicians, there's an additional layer of trust added by professional ethics. These ethics hold each practitioner accountable for their work. So when something goes wrong, we can ask, were they in breach of their ethics? And if that's the case, they can be deemed untrustworthy and possibly lose their ability to practice. Ethics provides accountability, provides trust. This idea of trusting professionals because of their ethics is so well established that when we talk about trusting doctors and other medical professionals, we instinctively start talking about the Hippocratic Oath and cite the famous "first do no harm" clause. Ethics is woven into the fabric of our society. It's there all the time, even when we don't think about it, even when we don't think it's there. We watched over our son in the NICU for a full 3 weeks. On one of those long days, a nurse came up to me with a question I've heard a lot over the years. She must have overheard one of my conference calls in the hallway and figured I worked on the web or something like that. So she asked, "How do social network sites make money?" I grinned and told her to imagine a giant blue monster staring at her from inside the internet saying, "Come here, data cow. My algorithms will find all your biases and stoke them to make you addicted to my service, and I will turn that addiction into money." I don't think that was the answer she expected, but it led to a very interesting conversation about the dangers of online filter bubbles. Anyway, I think you get my point here. We all know a lot of the stuff on the internet is not built with the best interests of the user in mind. That means When the people who dedicate their lives to saving us, those people we have come to think of as essential workers during the crisis, come to the internet with their private and financial and health information, they want to trust us. But they are starting to suspect that trust is misplaced. That trust we've been coasting on, powered by promises of an online utopia, is starting to erode badly. And in the wake of eroding trust comes government intervention fueled by corporate lobbyists. In short, we have work to do, my friends. We need to start acting like the professionals we want to become. And the first step in that process is embracing ethics as part of our practice. To have a meaningful conversation about ethics, we need to define our terms. Basically answer the question, what do we talk about when we talk about ethics, so that we're all talking about the same thing? There are two terms here that get used often interchangeably, and knowing the difference between them is important. They are morals and ethics. We use these terms all the time in everyday language because morals and ethics permeate our society and govern our own behavior and how we judge the behavior of other people around us. In the tech world, conversations about ethics have gathered a lot of momentum over the past several years, to the point where there are ethics talks like this one I'm doing right now at major tech conferences. And in the new pandemic reality, we're having conversations about ethics every day with each other, in the media, and in the political arena. So let's take a brief sidebar for Moral Philosophy 101 Pandemic Edition. First up, what is the difference between morals and ethics? Morals are our personal internal judgments about what is right or wrong. They are rooted in culture, religion, politics, and other social belief systems, and they are deeply personal to each of us. Ethics are the theories, tools, methods, and frameworks we create as a society that allow us to judge what is right or wrong. They're external, non-specific frameworks we collectively agree upon and the basis for things like rules and regulations and codes of ethics and even laws. So morals are internal, personal, individual. Ethics are external, community-based, and societal. Ethics are also not lists of rules and regulations and do's and don'ts, but they can be used to create such lists. Ethics are not universal. Different communities, cultures, countries, and regions have different ethics because people's morals are different. To see how this plays out in real life, consider the current issue of wearing masks in public. We have, each of us, an opinion on whether wearing a mask in public is good or bad and right or wrong. That opinion is heavily influenced by our own personal moral convictions. Some see wearing a mask as a moral obligation to self-preservation. Some see wearing a mask as a moral obligation towards others. Some see wearing or not wearing a mask as an expression of personal autonomy. These are all individual moral judgments based on our own individual morals. As a society, we need to make rules about how we interact with each other, and depending on the moral convictions of the populace in a particular region, we get different results. In some regions, masking is recommended, and the vast majority of people wear masks to protect other people. The ethics in those regions say we have an individual responsibility to one another, and each of us must choose how we want to act on that responsibility. In other regions, masking is mandatory. The ethics of those regions say society has an absolute obligation to protect everyone, and individuals must act on that responsibility. And in some regions, masking is voluntary and there are no official recommendations. The ethics of those regions puts personal freedom first and sees the imposition of masking onto the populace as unethical. This right here is why ethics is complicated. Each of us have our own moral judgments about masking, and each of us lives in a community with a more or less agreed upon ethics about masking. And from whatever region you're in and whatever personal moral standpoint and ethical framework you believe in, the other ones will seem morally and ethically questionable. This is the problem moral philosophy, this science of ethics, has tried to solve for the past several millennia. How do we, as individual moral actors, establish and agree upon ethical frameworks for our conduct in society, and how do we judge the goodness and rightness of acts in a consistent way? To put it in plain language, how do we as people know what's right or wrong? The best answer we have today is the same answer we've had for thousands of years. Ethics is a practice, and that's what I'm here to talk about. How do we build ethics into our design and development practice? Ethical practice is about being and doing, how we think and how we act. So how do we, as web designers and developers and creators, think and act in ways that are rooted in ethics without those ethics becoming a moralistic blanket snuffing out the fires of our creativity? I think the answer lies in rediscovering what the web is all about and rooting our practice in those principles. The internet is an information distribution network, and the web uses that internet to make the publishing, retrieval, and editing of information accessible to anyone with an internet connection and a sufficiently advanced computing device. The web, in its simplest form, gives us the capability to share our thoughts, ideas, and creations with the world, and access the thoughts, ideas, and creations of other people all around the world. Everything we do as web designers and developers is centered around granting, enabling, and enhancing these capabilities for our fellow human beings. So web design, at its core, is capability-centered design. But Morten, you say, we already do human-centered design, and we do that quite well. So what's the difference between human-centered design and this new capability-centered design? In my language, there's a term, noe som skurrer. It refers to the sound you hear from an engine that isn't quite right, or when you try to tune a radio and you keep getting a bit of static. That's how I've always felt about human-centered design. Det noe som skurrer. It took me a while to put my finger on it and then describe it and find a way of dealing with it to remove all that static. Let's take the now pretty much universal like or heart or star button on social media as an example. From a human-centered design perspective, this button can be made pretty perfect. It can be fully accessible, understandable, usable in any context, and the recent history of the web has proven beyond any doubt that it is both delightful and desirable. So the like button can be said to be a good example of human-centered design, and a very narrow definition of it at least. But is it ethical? No. We know for a fact the like button is addictive, and the way it's used by companies to profile people and direct them towards more content and targeted advertising is not in the best interest of the user. Human-centered design, applied without serious consideration and care, opens the door to what I call design instrumentalism. The human becomes the instrument through which the design works to achieve the goal of the designer or their employer. The design is successful if the human user is able to use it as intended to open a door and walk through it or click a like button and get that dopamine rush. Human-centered design is a good design principle, but from an ethics perspective, it isn't sufficient. For a design to be both human-centered and ethical, we need to consider whether the design gives the human user the necessary capabilities to do and be what they value and have reason to value. We need to evaluate the design based on what the person who uses it can do with it, and whether that capability allows them to live a life that is meaningful to them. Why? Because design is inherently political. I know calling anything political these days tends to get people all fired up, so let me be clear about this. Design as politics is not a new idea. Designers have been talking about the political implications of design for at least 100 years. In 2018, David A. Banks says, engineers need to think of their work as both a humble contribution to the ongoing social order, but also as an imposition, as a normative statement with politics and consequences. This here applies to designers as well, maybe even more so because our designs are approachable by anyone encountering them. In 2015, designer Mike Montero wrote this: "If a thing is designed to kill you, it is by definition bad design. You are responsible for what you put into the world and how it affects the world." In 1975, the philosopher Mario Bunge published an article called Towards a Techno-Ethics, where he said, "The technologist must be held not only technically, but also morally responsible for whatever he designs or executes. Not only should his artifacts be optimally efficient, but far from being harmful, they should be beneficial, and not only in the short term, but also in the long term." And all the way back in 1964, 22 prominent designers and visual communicators published the First Things First manifesto, which reads in part, "Designers who devote their efforts primarily to advertising, marketing, and brand development are supporting and implicitly endorsing a mental environment so saturated with commercial messages that it is changing the very way citizen consumers speak, think, feel, respond, and interact. To some extent, we are all helping draft a reductive and immeasurably harmful code of public discourse. Design is political because as designers, we make choices on behalf of the people we design for, about what they can and cannot access, about what they can and cannot do, about how the world should and shouldn't work. And nowhere is this political role of design on more prominent display than on the web. Just look at the current public discourse around the role of the web in politics and democracy. So yeah, human-centered design is a good design principle, but from an ethics perspective, it is not sufficient. And from an I want to leave the world a better place than I found it for my son and his generation perspective, we have work to do, and that work has to start now. I want you to imagine a box in front of you. Open it, put everything you know and have heard about ethics and design ethics and codes of ethics and ethical AI and the Hippocratic Oath for tech in that box, close the lid, and put it to the side. Let's start with a clean slate. I'm going to introduce you to a two-factor approach to practical ethics in design and technology. I call it simply capability-centered design. There are two parts to this approach: being and doing. The being part is about making ethical reflection part of your daily, personal, and professional practice, learning how to think about things through the lens of ethics, and making ethical practice part of who you are as a person and part of the DNA and fabric of your company or organization or community. The doing part is about applying ethical principles to decision-making at every level of your practice, actively rooting every decision you make in ethical principles to make better solutions that work for everyone. In moral philosophy, we have this beautiful term to describe the true north of ethics: human flourishing. I think this should be the true north for design practice as well, so let's make that our central hypothesis. Ethical web design is work furthering human flourishing through ethical practice and methodology centered on the rights, capabilities, and agency of the human end user. Let's start with being. The great thing about ethics is we're not starting from scratch. The human race has pondered ethics for thousands of years, and through discourse and collaboration and experimentation, our civilization has refined moral philosophy down to three main branches: virtue ethics, duty ethics, and utilitarianism. And here's the interesting thing. From a moral philosophy perspective, these branches are mutually exclusive. But from a practical ethics perspective, they're actually best used in combination, which is what we are going to do. I acknowledge in saying all this that these are all Western philosophies, and the Western approach to philosophy is not the only one. Moral philosophies from non-Western cultures are also deeply relevant to the ethical discourse and the ethics of design, and whenever possible, I've pulled in practices and concepts from those sources into the approach I'm presenting here. So, what are these moral philosophies, and how do they relate to web design? The branch you're most familiar with, whether you know it or not, is utilitarianism, itself a branch of a larger moral philosophy called consequentialism. Utilitarianism judges the goodness and rightness of an act based on the utility of its outcome. A good act is one that produces a beneficial outcome to the most people. Utilitarianism is built into the core of design and design language and the entire tech sector. Primary user groups, design for the majority, edge cases, the 80-20 principle, graceful degradation, all these terms are expressions of a utilitarian approach to design. Good design is design that benefits the majority. Framed like this, you can also see the challenge in using utilitarianism as an ethical platform. If a design is measured solely on its benefit to the majority user, the minority user becomes irrelevant. And we see this in web design and in the tech sector all the time. Accessibility is sidelined for fancy design interactions. Support for older devices is deprecated. Services rely on fast, persistent, high-bandwidth internet connections for proper functionality, etc. Knowing this, how do we use utilitarianism in web design to promote human flourishing? By focusing on the utility of a design while also including those outside the majority user group. So yes to captions in social media videos because they benefit everyone, including those who require captions, and no to facial recognition because by this time everyone knows it has extreme racial bias and Black Lives Matter. The next branch is duty ethics or deontology. Here, the goodness and rightness of an act is judged by whether the actor, or in our case, the designer, acted in accordance with their duty to the person acted upon and the larger community. Duty ethics is most accurately described by Kant's categorical imperative, which states, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. In modern English, that roughly translates to act in the same way you'd want every other person to act in the same situation. Duty ethics is about principles. You make decisions because you think they are the right ones, and by making those decisions, you are saying everyone else should also make those same decisions. In the book Permanent Record, Edward Snowden captures this idea quite effectively. Because a citizenry's freedoms are interdependent, to surrender your own privacy is really to surrender everyone's. Saying that you don't need or want privacy because you have nothing to hide is to assume that no one should have or could have anything to hide. Duty ethics tells us we should build things like privacy into our designs because everyone should build things like privacy into their designs. It's the principle that matters. There are two challenges to duty ethics in relation to design. First, ought doesn't always mean can. We as designers and developers are not always in a position to make the decisions necessary to include things like privacy features. So even though we ought to include them, sometimes we can't. Secondly, duty ethics are deeply rooted in our values, and our values are a gateway to subjective moral relativism. When a gun rights advocate in the United States designed a website to give away plans for how to build 3D printed guns, he did it because he believed everyone should print their own guns. He even used this argument when challenged by authorities about the website. And bizarrely, according to pure duty ethics, that isn't morally wrong because he's acting based on his duty to the categorical imperative. So knowing this, how do we use duty ethics in web design to promote human flourishing? By focusing on our shared principles, establishing best practices for ourselves and our peers, and always asking the questions, is this a decision I'd want every other person in the same situation to make? And if everyone did this, would we be promoting human flourishing? So yes to progressive enhancement because the web evolves at the pace of our cowpaths, and no to crypto miners as an alternative to online advertising because if everyone did it, the internet would stop working. The third branch is also the oldest and most unfamiliar to us, at least at first glance. Virtue ethics judges the goodness and rightness of an act based on whether it is rooted in a virtue the actor aspires to possess, whether the act itself is a virtuous one. And yes, that sounds super circular because it is. Thank you, Aristotle. Now, the term virtue has taken on a kind of life of its own in the political discourse, so a clarification is necessary here. A virtue in this context is a property defining and describing a person. Aristotle proposed a series of virtues including courage and magnificence and pride and honor, which I guess are virtues you could aspire to. More in line with our conversation, though, the philosopher Shannon Vallor has proposed a set of techno-moral virtues, which I think apply quite nicely to design. Honesty, self-control, humility, justice, courage, empathy, care, civility, flexibility, perspective, magnanimity, and technomoral wisdom. So virtue ethics in the context of design means asking yourself, is this decision one someone who is honest and just and humble and empathetic would make? There are two immediate challenges to using virtue ethics in design. First, how do we, as a community, define and agree upon our virtues? And second, how do we avoid this becoming a deeply conservative cage where we can only do what others have done before? After all, the easiest way of acting like someone who has virtue is literally mimicking what someone else is doing. Knowing this, how do we use virtue ethics in web design to promote human flourishing? By defining our virtues and challenge our ideas and idols and best practices. The work on defining virtues has already begun in the form of all those codes of ethics and Hippocratic oaths for tech that you see all over the place. These are effectively value statements based on our shared virtues, so that work is already ongoing and we should all be taking part in it. Secondly, we need to challenge our ideals and idols and best practices. Why? Because for the most part, the web design world is still defined by people like me. White, heterosexual, middle-class men with stable and secure jobs, top-of-the-line equipment, living in areas with fast, reliable, high-bandwidth internet. If we aim to make ethical decisions about web design, our virtues need to reflect the diversity of our community and our audience. That means not just bringing women and people of color and people reflecting the full spectrum of ability, neuro, gender, and sexual diversity to the table, but making them first-rate citizens of our teams, our processes, our work, and everything we do. So yes to blocking hateful and harmful speech online because speech acts have real consequences, and no to surveillance capitalism because the wanton manipulation of human beings for profit through design is not what a virtuous designer would do. Now I think you're starting to see how this all fits together. Each of these moral philosophies gives us an ethical lens through which we can inspect our designs, and each covers a different part of the design interaction. Utilitarianism looks at the utility of the design on society as a whole. Duty ethics looks at the intention of the designer, and virtue ethics looks at who the designer becomes by creating the design. Which leaves one gaping hole in the process, the person at the other end of the experience, the user. That's where a relatively new branch of moral philosophy comes in, and this is what makes the whole process work. It's called capability approach, and unless you're a developmental economist or you've seen one of my talks previously, there's little chance you've heard of it. Capability approach is a theoretical framework that judges the goodness and rightness of an act based on two principles. One, the freedom to achieve well-being is of primary moral importance. And two, that freedom to achieve well-being is to be understood in terms of people's capabilities, that is, their real opportunities to do and be what they have reason to value. So unlike the other moral philosophies, capability approach focuses solely on the capabilities and autonomy of the person acted upon. An act is good and right if it grants the person acted upon the capabilities to be and do what they value and have reason to value. Whether or not they actually use these capabilities is entirely up to them. We actually see capability approach in design thinking all the time, although we never explicitly think about it in these terms. This visualization of the difference between equality and equity is a great example, especially because the bike is used as the canonical example for a capability approach. Although giving everyone a bike might seem like a good act, it is only really a good act if every individual can use that bike in a way that is meaningful to them. Capability approach reminds us with every decision that people need solutions that work for them in their context, which is what we talk about when we talk about accessibility and content and context and design for everyday life and stress cases and all this stuff other speakers have brought to this stage over the years. Now, remember that hypothesis I proposed earlier? Ethical web design is work furthering human flourishing through ethical practice and methodology centered on the rights, capabilities, and agency of the human end user. Now I think you see why I think capabilities should be at the center of our design process. I call this setup the four corners approach, and that's how I encourage you to use it. When thinking about or discussing the ethics of a design, hold that design up against the lens of each of these corners, starting with capabilities, then moving to utilities, then to duties, then to virtues, and then all the way back to capabilities again. That way, you'll touch on all four corners of the interaction. The capabilities of the human being at the center of the interaction, their effects on the community, your reasoning for making the design, and what that decision does and says about you as a designer and the company or organization you work for. Remember, the being part is about making ethical reflection part of your daily, personal, and professional practice, learning how to think about things through the lens of ethics and making ethical practice part of who you are as a person and part of the DNA and fabric of the company or organization or community you are in. The Four Corners approach is your guide as you start exploring this idea. Let me guess. Right now, you're sitting there thinking something along the lines of, good grief, this stuff is heavy. And also not very applicable to what I do. I feel you. Trust me. I've been there. I've spent the past 20 years of my life trying to embody this being part. I said ethics is a practice for a reason. This part, the being part, is a practice the same way that meditation is a practice. It takes time, it takes dedication, it takes trial and error, it takes practice. There's also a good chance you're in a work situation where you feel like a powerless cog in a giant machine, and that all this being stuff feels like the stuff for other people higher up in the hierarchy, people you can't influence or maybe even talk to in a meaningful way. Again, I feel you. Trust me. I'm right there with you. This being part is something we have to do together, and it'll take time. It's also how we build trust. This is the worldwide work medical professionals and pretty much every other profession that touches our personal lives did to give us the capability to trust them with our lives and the lives of our children. Like I said before, we, all of us together, have work to do. The good news is, there's also the doing part, and the doing part is immediately practical and applicable. So let all that heavy being stuff rest in the back of your mind, and let's explore how to apply ethics in your daily design practice. What I'm about to show you is an entirely new framework for decision-making in web design that I've developed over the past 3 years. I call it the Core Capability Framework. Working title, feedback encouraged, and it looks like this. 4 concentric circles. At the center, you find the core capability. Next step out is material capabilities, then meta capabilities, and finally environmental capabilities. To put this framework into context, I've come up with a relatable example. So here's the brief. A high school needs to build a website or some other web-based service to effectively communicate information about safety measures to students and their parents or guardians in advance of return to classes in the fall. The key here is this information must be accessible and understandable to the entire intended audience. This is a life and death situation. This project lands on your desk with a tight deadline and a massive ethical responsibility, keeping kids safe when they return to school in the midst of a pandemic. No pressure. So, here's how the core capability framework works in practice. We start at the center with the core capability. This is where we define what capability or capabilities we intend to grant the user through the design, effectively the purpose of the design. On the web, this is almost always related to information exchange in one form or another. Looking at the brief, the core capabilities are actually spelled out. Information must be accessible and understandable. Okay, so the capability of accessing the information and the capability of understanding the information are the core capabilities of this project, and we can measure the success of the design based on whether each affected user is granted these capabilities. The core capabilities become the true north for the project. Then we step up to the next circle, material capabilities. Here we look at what capabilities are furnished, afforded, or otherwise provided by the materials used for the communication. By material, I mean printed paper or audio or video, a downloadable document, a web page, an app, anything like that. By capabilities, I mean the capabilities provided the user by the material itself. Paper grants the capabilities of holding, folding, giving to others, sending by mail, writing on, copying, etc. A video grants the capabilities of playing, pausing, stopping, jumping around on the timeline. A web document grants the capabilities of parsing in different web browsers, being sent over the internet, highlighting and copying, and so on. In this circle, we carefully consider what the nature of the core capabilities are, what materials are appropriate for enabling those capabilities in the end user, and what extra capabilities are afforded by these materials. For our project, the best path towards achieving our core capabilities is to choose different materials. Physical paper mailers, a downloadable PDF emailed to every parent, an accessible website with the same information, and a captioned video. Each of these materials afford different capabilities which meet the goal capabilities for different people. Some may not have access to the internet or may not take information from a website seriously. Some may prefer filling out a form with a pen and paper, while others prefer filling it out in an official-looking PDF and then emailing it back to the school, while others again prefer having everything available on a website they can access on their phone. And for the kids, A captioned video may be the most effective way both to get their attention and get them to share that information with their friends. Now we can step up to the next circle and explore what meta capabilities each material may provide. These are capabilities afforded by the material that can be added to the exchange. The web is literally built on these meta capabilities. A hyperlink is such a meta capability. It adds the capability of navigating within a document or from one document to another. Design itself is another meta capability. In most media, we can design information to make it easier or harder to access and comprehend. Meta capabilities also encompass accessibility features. Alternative text to images gives those who can't see the image for any reason the capability to still access the information contained within the image. Captions and transcriptions in video and transcripts of audio files gives those who can't watch or hear the media file the capability of still accessing the information contained within. Anytime we add a hypertext feature to a web document, be that a strong tag to bold some text or a React component to create a fancy transition, we are adding meta capabilities to the core capabilities. The key here is to make sure, one, that these meta capabilities are appropriate and improve our chance of core capability success, and two, that the success of the core capabilities are not dependent on these meta capabilities. To put it in plain HTML terms, if information access and understandability is the goal, the user should be able to download the HTML document and read it as plain text. Anything extra is literally a meta capability. In our project, immediately obvious meta capabilities include correctly marked up and easy to understand text links, providing both in-video captions and transcriptions of video and audio files, and adding human-made translations in languages known to be used by the audience, as well as links to translation services for those in need of translation. This brings us to the final outermost circle, environmental capabilities. These are the capabilities added by the user's environment, meaning we as designers usually have no control over whether they are available or not. They are therefore theoretical capabilities or known unknowns. The most obvious example of environmental capabilities are all the features built into a standard web browser. The ability to click to follow links, use the address bar, fill out forms, navigate with a mouse or keyboard or touch or any other device, switching to dark mode or high contrast mode, etc. All of these are environmental capabilities that may be there, but might not. We don't know. Less obvious examples are ones that directly interject themselves into the designed experience. Firefox has a reader mode that strips away everything except the main body text and presents it in a uniform font. The desktop version of Firefox also has a text-to-speech function. If the user has an Apple TV or Chromecast or other connected device, they may choose to view online videos on their TV, and some browsers provide automated text translations to other languages. Some devices can now even auto-caption videos that are playing on the device even when no caption exists. This list is endless. Common to all these environmental capabilities is the fact we as designers don't know if they're available to the end user, and we also don't know if the end user will use them or is even aware of them. The best we can do is design for them if they are present and advise users of their use if it is beneficial to the success of the core capabilities. For our project, there's a good chance not every audience member can read and understand English. Adding the correct lang attribute to the HTML document where appropriate will allow users to take advantage of auto-translation features in their browsers, if they are there. Adding buttons for text sizing and to toggle dark mode on and off may help some users with accessibility needs more effectively access the content, and progressively enhancing the site by adding progressive web app functionality allows some users to add the site to their devices for quick reference during stress case scenarios. Environmental capabilities also extend beyond the basic design that we've created. We know by observation that people like to share things on social media, and many users are more likely to engage with content on social media. Our client, the school, might reach a larger audience and meet its core capabilities in more people by providing easily shareable content in the form of Instagrammable images and short social media videos with burned-in captioning. The best we can do sometimes is make the environmental capability available and simply hope it's being used. That, in all its simple complexity, is the core capability framework. And I hope you see through these examples that this is something you can use right now right away. Chances are most of this is actually already part of your process and practice. What the core capability framework does is make all of this concrete, built into a proper professional practice. These two tools, the Four Corners approach and the core capability framework, make up the doing and being, which together form what I call capability-centered design. This is what practical ethics for the modern web designer can look like. And if you adopt this concept, this being and doing, this ethical practice will help you do work furthering human flourishing through ethical practice and methodology centered on the rights, capabilities, and agency of the human end user. It also gives you an actionable framework to take on all those sticky ethical and ethics adjacent issues that arise in web design projects. Question: why do we need to invest in accessibility? Answer: if our design goal is to give people the capability of reading this article or watching this video or buying this guinea pig armor or organizing a protest, the capability has to be accessible to everyone who interacts with our design. Question: why do we need to add a privacy policy and privacy features to our site? Answer: if our design goal is to give people the capability of uploading personal information to our service, they must also have the capability of knowing what that entails and the capability of controlling how their privacy is managed by us. Question: why do we need to use gender-neutral language and invest in visual assets displaying a broad diversity of people? Answer: if our design goal is to give people the capability of being hired for their skills and experience, we need to use words and visual imagery to accurately reflect and normalize diversity and inclusion, while also dismantling systemic racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and all these other archaic features of our modern society. Question: why do we need to make ethics part of the DNA and fabric of our company? Answer: if we want to design the future for other people, to impose our vision onto the world, to carve a path through the snow and ask the world to follow us, we must give the world the capability of trust. We have come full circle. What's this climbing, huh? What's this climbing? Are you climbing around? Trust is the currency of interactions, and it is a currency we as web designers need to start investing in. Whenever I talk about ethics in design and tech, someone always comes up to me and says, "But Morten, there's always a person careless enough or uninformed enough or untrained enough or enterprising enough or bullied enough or desperate enough to do the unethical thing. So even if I don't do it, someone else will." This is the problem of evil, and it's not a problem I or anyone else can solve. What we can do is make it less relevant by being humble, being accountable, being self-aware, and by being graceful to ourselves and our peers whenever mistakes are made. We are human beings foremost, and we are far from perfect, but we can practice and strive to be better. Using ethics as a design tool holds us accountable to our desire to shape the world to our vision. Because with every design decision, we build the future for our users and for ourselves. Build the future. That's the work. What we can or cannot do, what we consider possible or impossible, is rarely a function of our true capability. It is more likely a function of our beliefs about who we are. So let's believe we are ethical web practitioners and stand in solidarity and grace with our users and ourselves as we design a future where all humans have the capability to flourish. Thank you.